Chapter 15. Joy and Despair. Twin Union victories on the 4th of July propel the spirits of Northerners to new heights and of Southerners to new lows. Grant gets another unconditional surrender under his belt with the capture of Vicksburg. Newly appointed Union General George Meade defeats Lee, and at Gettysburg with help from some truly extraordinary heroics on his flanks, on the left flank at Little Round Top and on the right flank against a formidable rebel cavalry charge. Lee offers his resignation while Lincoln immortalizes the brave who gave their life, not for land, but for a principle, with 271 words in November, July 4th, 1863.
This is Carter Anderson with breaking news. On the day of its 87th birthday, the United States celebrates two extraordinary victories on the battlefield, one in Mississippi and the other in Pennsylvania. First came the news of the surrender of Vicksburg to General Ulysses S. Grant, the city many regard as the most important prize on the Mississippi River. President Lincoln called Vicksburg the key to the Confederacy, and declared that the war could not be won until the key is in our pocket. Today, that key was delivered into the Union pocket.
The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea. Grant is my man, and I am his the rest of the war.
The clouds are truly dark over us. The disasters in Mississippi were both great and unexpected to me. But I have not yet seen cause to waver in the conviction to which I have frequently given expression, that if our people now show as much fortitude as we are entitled to expect from those who display such conspicuous gallantry in the field, we shall certainly beat the enemy and secure our independence.
For more on this story, let's go first to Daniel Burke in Richmond, and then to Jackie Chase in Washington, D.C.
Carter, the mood here is glum. The news from Vicksburg was all the more shocking because it was considered unassailable. The garrison there had little choice but to surrender. By late June, the situation was growing desperate. Disease was running rampant and people were starving. When the cannon fire stopped, residents came out of the holes dug into the hills to feast on rations provided by Union soldiers.
Carter, not surprisingly, the atmosphere here in Washington is one of celebration. Two major victories on the 4th of July. The news could not be any better for President Lincoln. These two victories come at an important time as public support for the war has fluctuated since the beginning of the year, and recruitment efforts have become much more difficult. When the general of the Vicksburg garrison asked General Grant for terms of surrender, Grant repeated what he said at Fort Donelson, quote, "No terms except immediate and unconditional surrender," end quote. 29,495 Confederate soldiers were captured, paroled, and allowed to go home. Meanwhile, the victory at Gettysburg helps to erase the memories of the losses at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, both of which took many lives and demoralized the ranks of the Army of the Potomac. A procession with bands of music proceeded to the Executive Mansion. The crowd enthusiastically cheered the president, who appeared at an upper window and briefly spoke to the gathering.
How long ago is it? 80-odd years since, on the 4th of July, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation by its representatives assembled and declared as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. Now, on this 4th of July, when we have a gigantic rebellion, at the bottom of which is an effort to overthrow the principle that all men were created equal, we have the surrender of a most powerful position and army on that very day.
General Lee took the fight into Gettysburg because despite victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, the Army of Northern Virginia suffered huge losses during those battles. Additionally, the grounds of Northern Virginia are devastated by continuous fighting and encamping. Food is scarce, and forage non-existent. These factors convinced General Lee and President Davis that an invasion of the North, however hazardous, was less risky than continuing to defend Richmond. Another victory within striking distance of Washington, Baltimore, or even New York might have convinced Northerners and Europeans that the South could win, and deserved to win, its independence. Lee's victory at Chancellorsville included a huge haul of captured weapons. After Chancellorsville, 90% of Lee's infantrymen were equipped with rifles instead of smoothbores. This increased Lee's confidence in the effectiveness of his infantry. Lee's soldiers had overcome more daunting tasks at Gaines' Mill, Sharpsburg, and Chancellorsville. Gettysburg represented a chance to win the war. After the loss at Gettysburg, General Lee offered his resignation to President Davis.
Where am I to find that new commander who possesses the greater ability which you believe is required? If Providence would kindly offer such a person for our use, I would not hesitate to avail of his services. To ask me to substitute you by someone in my judgment more fit to command, or who would possess more of the confidence of the army or of the reflecting men in the country, is to demand for me an impossibility.
The victory at Gettysburg came with an enormous price for both sides. Anyone anxious about the definition of the word glory will find the answer at Gettysburg. It is very beautiful, rolling country here, but for 5 miles around there is an awful smell of putrefaction. One of the most revolting features of the field of battle is the large number of dead horses scattered over it. No effort has yet been made to bury them. At a field hospital, the first sight that meets the eye is a collection of semi-conscious but still living human forms, all of whom shot through the head and considered hopeless. Yet they groan and their limbs toss and twitch. A long table stood in the woods, and around it gathered a number of surgeons and attendants. This is the operating table. A wagon stood near, rapidly filling with amputated legs and arms. Then, wholly filled, this gruesome spectacle withdrew from sight and returned for another load.
November 19th, 1863.
Today, President Lincoln visited the battlefield that witnessed the loss of over 50,000 Union and Confederate soldiers. In the aftermath of the 3-day carnage that took place in early July, the hamlet of Gettysburg found itself surrounded by thousands of bloating corpses. Soon after the battle, torrential rain exposed the bodies lying in hastily prepared shallow graves. The arrival of summer's humid heat brought with it the nauseating stench of decaying flesh that attracted swarms of flies and marauding pigs. The bodies of the fallen had to be given a proper interment. The reburial of Union soldiers from the battlefield graves began on October 17th. The Committee for the Consecration of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg invited President Lincoln to formally set apart these grounds to their sacred use by a few appropriate remarks.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.